Here we go. I think in the interests of time, I will skip the early slides, which are just about the prevalence of violence against women, which you all know about. This is a project I've been working on for quite some time, and I'm now actually, I do have a contract to write a book, tentatively called Truth and Repair. And this is about what justice means to survivors, what justice might look like if survivors were ever consulted, which, as we know, they generally are not. So I talk about violence against women because this is what I know, this is what these are the people, the survivors, the people who I've worked with throughout my life. But I really think that this way of thinking would apply to any situation where relationships of dominance and subordination are deeply embedded in the culture over centuries. In our own country, this has to do with the legacy of colonialism and slavery, and in other countries also the legacies of colonialism and various forms of dictatorship and other kinds of oppression. This is the prevalence of violence against women in the US, a couple of surveys, large-scale epidemiological studies. Wherever countries in peacetime, developed countries, have similar statistics wherever they've been gathered. In wartime, of course, the prevalence of sexual violence increases vastly. And the population most at risk is children and young women. For this reason, in the US at least, other countries that are not at war, the prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder in women is twice that of men. And basically worldwide, now that we have special rapporteurs on human rights of women, what we find is that violence against women is a condition of impunity. There may be courts of law, but there is no justice for women and for other subordinated groups. This slide, apparently we have a technical problem that doesn't show my graph. So I will just have to ask you to imagine an exponential decay process which starts with, if you look at rate, the reporting rates are somewhere around 20% of actual prevalence or incidence. And then when you factor out cases that result in arrest, in a prosecution, and in a conviction or guilty plea, you're down around 5%, 0 to 5% of all cases. So that basically we're talking about a situation of impunity. And of course, my data are from the US, but I would be very surprised if they were different in other countries. We have a justice system that would seem to be actually perfectly designed to exacerbate post-traumatic stress in victims. Victims need safety, they need protection, but filing a complaint means increased risk of retaliation from the perpetrator or his friends or family or gang. Survivors need time to recover. For recovery, the timetable of justice is dictated by the court, and the survivor's needs are in no way taken into account. Survivors need acknowledgement. They need to be treated with respect and dignity. The court subjects them to a challenge of their credibility, where their whole character is going to be smeared. Survivors need to establish a sense of control. The courts have their own rules and procedures that are often opaque, and where the timetable, everything is at the whim of the court. And instead of being able to tell their stories personally at a time and place of their choosing, in court, people are subjected to yes or no narratives and cross-examination, yes or no questions. So, of course, survivors want to avoid anything that reminds them of the trauma, especially confrontation with the perpetrator, and that is, of course, what happens in court. As one of the people I interviewed put it, for your own peace of mind, just throw any ideas you had about justice out the window. She was a survivor of domestic violence who went to court first for a restraining order and then to try to get a divorce settlement that would not impoverish her. And as you see, she was not pleased with her experiences in the justice system. So the study I have done is an in-depth interview study with 30 survivors of gender-based violence. I did include some men who had been abused by men, as is generally the case. It was a diverse group of people in terms of class background, geographic background, ethnicity, religious background, and so forth. But it was a convenient sample. I just put out the word that I was interested in interviewing survivors. Because I live in a university community, not surprisingly, the majority of the survivors I interviewed had a college education or above, so that is not representative. And just to summarize the findings of my study, and these are corroborated, I think, by many other sources. There were some points on which there was really unanimous consensus, and these are the ones I've highlighted here. The acknowledgement of what happened, the facts, but also the harm, and not just acknowledgement by the perpetrator or even primarily by the perpetrator. What the survivors wanted was community acknowledgement of the facts. The crimes isolate them from their communities through shame and secrecy and fear. They wanted the facts known, they wanted the harm recognized by their community, and they wanted the community to denounce the crime. They wanted the community to say, this matters, this was wrong, you are not to blame. And they wanted the burden of shame, if you will, to be lifted from their own shoulders and placed where it belonged, on the shoulders of the perpetrator. So those were the points of unanimity. There was less, there was more of a range of feelings about things like apology, restitution. I would say actually prevention of future harm was something that people were pretty unanimous about, but not everybody mentioned it. And then exposure and containment of the offender was something that most people wanted or explicitly said they wanted. What I didn't hear much about, and this is despite asking specifically about these things and really giving permission for expressions of hatred and wish for revenge and punishment. No, the survivors I spoke to were not very interested in punishment. They wanted rehabilitation for the offenders, but they were skeptical about whether we had any models for making that happen, whether we knew how to make that happen. And they were not very interested in forgiveness either. Let me just give you some, this is the take-home message here, and let me just give you some examples. About acknowledgement, as one of the survivors put it, she is again a survivor of domestic violence, I want people to know who he is and what he did to another human being. And the recognition of their humanity was sometimes very much on the minds of a number of survivors mentioned, I'm a human being. I want to be treated like a human being. This is the issue about vindication, and this is the story of Ross Chait, who is a survivor of childhood abuse by a boys' choir, by the choir master who was very charismatic and who was a predator, basically, preyed on many of the boys. As an adult survivor, he tried to file criminal charges. The court ruled that the statute of limitations had expired. I know that's an issue that you want to discuss a lot, that criminal charges were not, could not go forward. And this was despite the fact that Professor Chait had found at least 2 other survivors who were willing to confirm, also willing to testify. So then he filed civil lawsuits, one against the perpetrator and one against the choir. And he said that it was a very emotional experience for him, even though he was trained as an attorney, he knew how the justice system worked, but when he was the survivor, he played hardball, as he called, which is what the justice system is all about. It's a fight. It's just a fight without weapons. And the other side had very high-powered lawyers, at least the choir did. The perpetrator never showed up in court for his civil action. So the judgment went to Professor Chait by default. And he had to testify for the judge to name the amount of money. In civil courts in the US, the damages are measured, the degree of harm is measured by the amount of money that is settled on. And usually what happens is there is a negotiation and between the two sides, and a dollar figure is agreed upon. And often in the US, there is no admission of guilt on the part of the responsible parties, and often a non-disclosure agreement so that the whole thing is secret and basically just money is paid. This is not what Professor Chipe wanted. In the case of the perpetrator, he had already left the state. He, and by the way, started a boys' choir in another, affiliated with another church. So he was never going to see a dime of that money. But what mattered to him was when the judge said this is worth $500,000, he said money is what counts in people's eyes. And so this was important. And he felt that the community had affirmed its support of him. By the way, the settlement with the choir really puzzled these high-powered lawyers because Professor Chipe didn't care about the money. He cared, but what he wanted was an admission of responsibility on the part of the choir and a public apology. And they were baffled. But they eventually conceded. I mean, on the eve of having to go to court, they conceded. What they would not concede about was Professor Chipe wanted them to seek out all the boys who had been part of that choir, who were now adults, and reach out to them and inform them. And they said, no, they absolutely would not do that. And that was not, that was not a remedy for his claim. But of course, from his point of view, that's exactly what was needed. So again, the mismatch, even with a highly educated white male who was an attorney who knew how to work the system, this was the mismatch. Apologies are important because true apologies, sincere apologies, really often they have an amazing emotional effect. When a perpetrator is truly remorseful, acknowledges responsibility, and sort of humbles himself before the victim and says, what can I do to make amends? That, any feelings of rage and revengefulness and hatred that are burdening the survivor, that almost feel like a foreign body within, that are ego alien, as we say, those feelings just often just resolve. They're gone. And forgiveness is often a spontaneous response to a true apology. And so here's somebody who says, I'll never be able to forgive, but then even if imagining in her mind a true apology, she feels relief. So that's the magic of apology. And here's the problem of the insincere apology. A lot of survivors didn't want to go anywhere near any kind of interchange with the perpetrator because they felt what they were going to get was the politician's apology. I regret if anyone was harmed. or else, as Caroline said, he would enjoy, he would feel, it would be another expression of power over. And then she really didn't want social pressure for forgiveness. It's one thing for true forgiveness to emerge as a spontaneous feeling. When people try to force themselves to forgive or other people try to force them, it's a very different feeling. This brings us to the subject of restorative justice, which often envisages exactly this kind of I and thou encounter between the victim and perpetrator, witnessed by the community, in which the relationship between the relationship between victim and perpetrator is healed. And in contrast to retributive justice, I think the appeal of it is that instead of a kind of legalistic framework where the issue is what statute has been violated, the issue is the harm that has been caused to the victim and the community. And rather than the state being in control of the process, it's an initiative from the victim and the community. Instead of an adversarial process, it's a consensus process, which results in restitution and repair rather than reparations, reconciliation rather than punishment. The promise is that whereas the victim is marginalized in the retributive justice system, the victim has the potential to be central. Most restorative justice is a movement that has many sources, including indigenous practices in many parts of the English-speaking world, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the US, but also religious practices, particularly in pacifist Christian religion, and of course, the most a well-known example of this is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, in which the victim really was central. I would argue that the great strength of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was that the testimony of survivors was the main event. It was broadcast on radio throughout the country and televised every day. The hearing that the compassionate hearing that was given to survivors really changed the narrative. It made it impossible for there to be a sort of revanchist Afrikaner narrative about their innocence and the purity, if you will, of their tyranny. The other great breakthrough, I thought, in that mode was that amnesty was conditional on confession by the perpetrators. And so you had a great many perpetrators who did confess and who were not prosecuted, but it was on the record that their crimes were on the record. Unlike other truth commissions where there's a commission report and it's filed away, this was a shared nationwide narrative. It's not always true, however, that the victim is central, because much of the restorative justice movement came out of really a focus on defendants, especially young defendants with nonviolent offenses. And it was only later that some of the major theorists of restorative justice came forward and admitted that, as Howard Zare put it, at first victims were just an annoyance. They got in the way of fairness for defendants. And only later did they realize that, yes, the victim was as important a part of the process as the defendant. One model of repair, I think actually the biggest deficit, as I see it, of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was that there was no restitution. There was no reparations for the harms, the terrible harms that had been done to the majority Black population and the mixed race population that they had a special name for that I don't remember. Also the Asian population. We have a model in the, and you know, I think that just had to do with how much power the ANC had versus the ruling Afrikaners, and they were not able to negotiate reparations. We have a model of reparations in the US that's not widely known, so I'd like to share that. Because it addresses the whole point of, for example, what the case of Ross Chait, where he was awarded $500,000, but of course it was never going to be paid. And anyway, he didn't really want money from the perpetrator. That would feel like dirty money. I think certainly survivors of the Holocaust encountered that same issue in terms of accepting reparations money from Germany. A lot of people really, they needed that money, but they really didn't, they felt it was, that in some ways it defiled them. But at least that came from a government, not from individuals. And also individual reparations, it just depends. Some perpetrators have money, some don't. If they have money, they're going to pay for high-priced lawyers to, drag this out in court. What we have is a fund established in a law and order right-wing government under Ronald Reagan called the Victims of Crime Act, and it establishes a trust fund based on fines on convicted offenders. So it's not taxpayer money, but it's a way for offenders to pay back as a group to victims as a group. And for example, the VOCA money, and also victims, survivors, I should say, sit on the board of trustees that determines how the money is distributed. And so they have power over the fund. And the money has gone, first of all, to pay individual victims. It does mean filing a report, but it doesn't mean necessarily going to trial, for time lost from work, bills for health care, for mental health care. It also pays for support of rape crisis centers, battered women's shelters, and other victim services. So it's it really is a very useful model, I think, for other countries to consider. I also want to think in terms of the issue of reintegrative shaming. We talked about taking the burden of shame off of the shoulders of the victim and putting it where it belongs. But the shaming can happen two ways. It can happen in the form of ostracism. Let's cut this person out of society and let's put him in prison and punish him. Or it can take the form in restorative justice of trying to rehabilitate the perpetrator by bringing him back into community, but not by exclusion, but by saying we want to include you, but we want you to know that the whole community is angry and resentful and outraged about your behavior, and we need, it harms not only the survivor, the victim, it harms us too. And we will, we know about you now, and we're going to keep in touch with you to see how you change your behavior. We don't have very many models of doing this. One of the most widely disseminated models came out of a program for battered women in Duluth, Minnesota. And the Duluth Model, as it's called, is very widely practiced now and has been adapted for different cultures. Unlike anger management, which is often confused with, it comes from a feminist analysis of violence against women. It doesn't think of violence, domestic violence, as losing control, but rather as a means of exerting control, a choice, a way of both expressing power over and maintaining power over the victim. I mean, usually domestic violence perpetrators are not just randomly attacking people on the street or at work. They certainly don't attack their bosses. They attack people in the privacy of their homes. They're women, they are children, they are women, to show them who's boss. So it's a lot about accountability for men. They are accountable for changing their behavior, and that is going to be monitored, mainly by making sure that the victim is safe and by hearing from the victim frequently about what's going on. If the victim chooses to try to reconcile, or if the victim does not and does not want to be stalked. So the safety and well-being of the victim is the main criterion of success, not whatever happens to the perpetrator. So yeah, so these are group sessions, not individual sessions, and members are expected to, they understand each other's rationalizations and excuses because they've done the same thing. So they are expected to challenge one another. In most cases, participation is not voluntary on the part of the men. It is enforced by court order. There are some reasonably convincing data that over time, maybe over the time course of a couple of years, we're not talking a quick fix here. The violent incidents go down, and the victim's sense of well-being increases. So let's just talk then a little bit about forgiveness, because this is the other agenda, I think. Just as there's an agenda of punishment for the retributive justice systems that we have, there is an agenda, often an agenda of forgiveness in restorative justice. Not always. There are many practitioners now who do not put this kind of pressure on people. But it was certainly, as under the leadership of Archbishop Tutu, in the most well-known model, yes, reconciliation, forgiveness was very much part of the agenda. And this is the writer Jillian Slovo, a South African writer whose work may be familiar to you. And she said, forgiveness without genuine apology, it seems like asking much more of the victim than of the perpetrator, making the victim do all the work. And this is the critique that has come from the survivors I interviewed. This is a quote from a woman who was raped by a stranger. She became an attorney to work on issues of violence. But she grew up in she's the daughter of a Protestant minister and grew up in a very practicing Christian home. And what she says is that she doesn't, her idea of justice does not include reconciliation. She says, he doesn't need my forgiveness, he needs his creator's forgiveness. And she doesn't have a control over that, and she doesn't want to be any part of that. That was the interview she gave me almost 20 years ago. I recently recontacted her, and to see how she felt about it now, 20 years later. Well, not quite. Her case had gone to court and had resulted in a conviction and a prison sentence. And she felt that was okay because she thought this man was so dangerous. She thought he was going to kill her. And she also thought he had conned his way into her house by claiming that he had his car had died, and could he just come in to make a phone call to get, this is before the era of smartphones, of course. And once he came in, got into her house, he had overpowered her and raped her. But she figured that he had done this before. He had a well-practiced modus operandi. But he died in prison. I don't know the circumstances. So she says she didn't mean to be as harsh as her words suggested. She just felt that she didn't feel that without any, and she had reached out to him a number of times to try to have dialogue, and he had not wanted to have any acknowledgement or dialogue with her. So she felt that without that, she couldn't forgive unilaterally, but that she hoped that he would seek God. And actually, when he died, she found out where his funeral was going to be, and she quietly attended his funeral in the back of the church without revealing her identity, just so that she knew that he had a family who mourned him. She said, I was just tired of anger and resentment. I was healthier and happier when I just let go of all those feelings. So that's what I would call unilateral forgiveness. It's very different from the I and thou interaction with a genuine apology. But she says, I call it, I'm not sure it is forgiveness, but it's peace. And many survivors aspire to this state of being able to let go of their anger and bitterness.
Professor Herman?
Yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but we're running out of time. So
Yeah, I'm almost done.
I think that forgiveness and peace would be a good time to take a pause. And out of the many questions that the women here wanted to ask you, I would choose one of them. And I would refer the question to you, okay? Your legendary book, Trauma and Recovery, was written almost 20 years ago. What is your perspective today on PTSD and its connection with statute of limitation?
And its connection to?
Statute of limitation.
I'm sorry, but please repeat the last part of your, its connection to what?
Statute of limitation.
Well, I think that's a kind of that's a whole other talk. There is I did write, in 2015, they brought out a new edition of Trauma and Recovery. I did write an epilogue that sort of brought things up to date, both on the trauma side in terms of new research and on the recovery side in terms of, new research and experience. And I would be happy to send you that text. I don't know whether, there's probably not a new edition in Hebrew, but I can certainly send you the English version of the epilogue, and that would be the sort of the answer to that question. And I guess the other answer to that question is, in the book that I will hopefully be published next year.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for finding the time and joining us today. It was very inspirational, and we would like to thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.